as some of you may know, I graduated from the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in late 2019, and I was bound to start a postdoc position in New York in early June 2020. So obviously 2020 was not the best year for an international move from Japan to the US, specifically from Okinawa to New York City. And today I would like to share my journey on the delays, on the difficulties I faced, and basically the story how I managed to move from Japan to the US, or more specifically from Okinawa to New York City in the middle of 2020. And was a very difficult time. I eventually sought help from our mental health service at my graduate university, so at OIST, just because of how difficult everything was. And yeah, you may understand while hearing my story. But yeah, so if I get emotional, please understand that it was a very difficult process. And I'm not even sure if anyone is interested in this or not, but many people have encouraged me to share this story, and so I thought I would do exactly that. And I again have notes down here, so if I look down, it's because I'm consulting my notes. I very well know what happened, but I don't want to miss something, or yeah, I'm trying to follow the chronological order of events as much as possible. So I believe the story kind of starts in August 2019 when I accepted a postdoc position at NYU, and we decided that I would start in early June in 2020. So eventually we settled on June 8th, and so my start date for my postdoc position was June 8th, 2020. The reason for that was so I graduated from OIST at the end of November 2019, but I had specific experiments that I wanted to finish up before moving on to NYU. And my graduate university, OIST, has kind of a 6 months transition program that allows you to do exactly that, stay on for 6 months, up to 6 months after you graduated to finish off some of your projects. So I thought I would stay till the end of May. Also, our graduation ceremony is usually at the end of May. So I thought I would stay for graduation to finish up my experiments, and then at the end of May, early June, I would move on to my postdoc position. And in late February 2020, we already knew about the virus being in China and spreading around the world, but it still looked like countries had a chance to be able to contain it. And so in late February 2020, everyone still thought that we would be able to get me to New York in June. And anecdotally, at the end of February 2020, I was still traveling to a conference in Ventura, which is close to Los Angeles, in the US. And I was still in the US in late February 2020 for a conference. And while I was at that conference, I actually got an email telling me that the university in New York, so NYU, had mailed out a specific piece of paper that I needed in order to apply for my visa at the US Embassy in Japan. So I got those news. I wasn't quite sure if the piece of paper would be sent back because it would arrive before I got back to Japan myself, but I was quite lucky. I got back to Okinawa and then I got the piece of paper. It took about 10 days to get it mailed, so in the second week of March, I want to say. So I got the piece of paper and I knew I had to fill out some other forms online and to apply for an appointment with the US Embassy in Japan for an interview to actually get the visa. And so, yeah, I knew I had to gather some more papers on my end. And so I started to do all of that. I tried to fill out the paperwork as fast as I could because talking to other people, I knew that it was kind of difficult to get an appointment for the interview with the US Embassy or Consulate. And yeah, I actually managed to fill out all the paperwork in 2 days' time, get a new passport or a new picture, like, you know, the formal picture where you can't smile. That kind of picture taken according to US standards because their size, of course, is a little bit different than the standard size in Europe or in Japan. And I got all of that done, and then I got to the point where I had to make an appointment with the US Embassy / Consulate. And we have a consulate on the island of Okinawa, so I strongly prefer to make an appointment there rather than have to fly to a different city to have my interview there. So I looked at appointment times for Naha, or for the US Consulate in Naha, and there were appointment times for the next week. I think the next week, Monday at 8:30 a.m. and I really didn't want to get up at like 6:30 a.m. or something to go to the interview. So I was thinking maybe I should schedule it later and see if they have later appointments. I looked and the appointments were all at 8:30 a.m. or 8:45 a.m. So yeah, it literally made no difference. But then I was also thinking, because obviously I'm German and I was applying in Japan, I wanted to gather some additional papers. And so I was thinking maybe I need more time for that. And I was considering scheduling the interview for a later point in time, not the next Monday, not right away. And then I talked with a friend about it and she was like, no, absolutely take the earliest appointment available. Just, you know, in case you need to go back, you're missing some papers and you need to go back, that gives you more time. So I took the appointment the next Monday and I got there at 8:30 a.m. I think I actually got there at 8 a.m. and then went to a convenience to get coffee. But I was terrified to be too late, so I got there at 8:30 a.m. They let me in the room. I had like all my documents, handed them over, and then I waited for my interview for like, I think for 2 hours, or I waited for a long time. And once the visa interview was over, they told me right away that I got the visa and that they would send my passport to, I assume, Tokyo, so that they can actually put in the visa stamp and then they would send it back to me. And about, I'm not even sure, about 4 days after I had my interview at the US Consulate in Naha, all the US embassies and consulates across Japan closed, like because of the virus. They closed for any kind of services, including passport services for US citizens. So obviously they were still processing visas that had been approved before they closed the embassies, but they closed them for, any kind of appointment, interviews, anything. So I was extremely lucky that I managed, or I scheduled my visa interview before the embassies and consulates closed. And I am extremely thankful to my friend who convinced me to schedule the visa interview that early. Sure enough, I got my passport back with my visa stamped into it, and I was one of the fortunate people who had their visa, and we're still ready to go, more or less. At about the same time, the Japanese borders closed completely, except for Japanese citizens. They wouldn't leave anyone in who returned with a residence card. Obviously no tourists, but even if you had a resident card, you had a flat in Japan, you couldn't come back. So I knew if I would leave, it would be really final, and if I wouldn't be able to enter the US on the US side for whatever reason, they would potentially deport me to Germany, because there was no way they could deport me back to Japan. It's one thing to leave a country, it's another thing leaving a country you lived in for 6 years, knowing that you can't return in the near future to visit because the borders are closed for tourism, and it's breaking my heart to know that it will be some time till I can return. And of course, like, our graduation ceremony last year, May, was cancelled. So there is kind of the idea that we may have a graduation ceremony that's postponed. But again, because of the current border situation, I don't really know for how long. All of a sudden, leaving Japan became a lot more of a final step than it used to feel like. But it was still fine, at least I was still at that point able to enter the US. Everything looked like I would potentially still be able to go. And we would maybe be able to figure something out. But about, I don't know, maybe a week later, cases really started to spike in the US. And especially in New York City, we all know that New York City was ground zero for the coronavirus, and New York City went into its first lockdown, and I obviously didn't know how bad it was, but in general, cases were spiking, and I then eventually had a Skype call with my new PI at NYU, and it was a pretty emotional Skype call. And he basically told me that the situation in New York City is bad, like really, really bad. And that he is afraid every day that someone in the lab may catch the virus, or some friend, or, you know, someone in the department. And yeah, obviously he told me he would prefer if we could push back my start date. And I was kind of expecting that Skype call, because obviously I knew cases in New York City were spiking. And you know, it was the obvious thing to do, it was the right thing to do. It didn't make things easier. But yeah, my new PI, he wanted to keep everyone in the lab safe. And Okinawa at that point had way less cases, or Japan in general had way less cases than the US. And the feasible thing was to leave me in Okinawa for the time being, where you have, you know, less dense population. I was commuting by car. And in general, it seemed to be the safer option for me. So obviously after that point, I wasn't sure what to do. You know, my contract at OIST was supposed to end on May 31st, and officially the kind of contract I was on was non-extendable. And on top of that, my housing at OIST was always coupled onto my contract because I was subletting. So basically my flat was rented by OIST, and then I was subletting it from OIST. So I was like in the situation where on May 31st or June 1st, I would not only lose my income, I would also lose the roof over my head. And yeah, because I did have some savings that I could have lived off, but I wouldn't have had a flat any longer, and it's really hard to rent as a foreigner in Japan. So I could maybe have moved to an Airbnb, but you know, Airbnbs and hotels are pretty expensive on Okinawa. So yeah, I wasn't sure what to do. The other obvious option to go back to Germany wasn't feasible for me from like several reasons. Of course, I didn't want to move my stuff twice, and as I said at that point, I couldn't return to Japan once I left, since the borders were closed, so it wasn't really an option to, you know, go to Germany, come back, and then move my stuff from Japan to the US. And on top of that, there were like some administrative considerations based on like how specific social systems work in Germany that for me made it not a good option to return to Germany at that point. In the meantime, I had also been looking at options to actually move my stuff, and Yamato, which is kind of a post or mail carrier in Japan, used to have a very cheap moving plan for you packing your boxes yourself. So you would get, I think, 2 large boxes and 4 small boxes, and you would pack them yourself, and they would pick them up and transport them for you from Japan to the US for like $800-900. So pretty affordable all in all. And that had been the plan I had planned to use. And when I inquired about it, I learned that it was suspended because of the virus. So all of a sudden, I didn't know how to move my stuff on top of that. And I was quite certain I would have to throw away and get rid of a lot more stuff than I had anticipated. Also, at this point, it was, I believe, late March, early April. So because I was only 2 months out from moving, I had already started to sell stuff. So I believe at that point, I had my couch left, and I had my dining table left and my dining chairs, and my bed was still in my flat, but I had sold, I believe, a couple of dressers already. So I started to live in a flat where I had, basically I used old moving boxes that I got from a friend to kind of tape together an improvised dresser, and that's where I would put my clothes in. And that's how I lived from early April on. I think I had sold like my side table and my table that was in my living room. And so I had sold some stuff already. And it wasn't really like, a nice cozy flat any longer. It felt like I was about to move, but then I wasn't, So obviously I couldn't do anything about the stuff I had sold. I couldn't do much about being out of options to move my stuff to the US. So I decided to worry about all of that later and tackle my main worry, which was not having a roof over my head after June 1st. And so I went to the graduate school office to talk to someone in charge of student contracts, or specifically the type of contract I was on at that point in time, to see whether there is any way that they can extend it given the extraordinary circumstances. And there was a lot on my mind, and I was really desperate. I didn't know what to do, and I started, they told me there is no one around, I would have to come back later, and I burst into tears. I started crying, and I was just an emotional little fluff ball at that point. And they took me aside. Obviously, there was no one there in charge of the contracts, but they still took me aside, and they asked me what was going on, and I told them what was going on, and told them my situation, and they were like, look, we don't know if we can do anything for you, and unfortunately for you, you are the first person who is stuck, but given what you just told us, we kind of anticipate that we may have a couple more people who get stuck on the island, and could you please write us an email with all of that in it, and also could you inquire with your supervisor whether he can or cannot fund the extension. And so I did that. I learned that my unit / my supervisor would not be able to fund my extension, or rather that they didn't know yet what their budget would be for the next year, and so they couldn't promise me that they would be able to fund my extension. And so I wrote an email with all of that information to graduate school. And then because I was really worried that there wouldn't be any money to pay my extension, I wrote an email to my co-supervisor to see whether maybe, he had some money in his budget to help me out with funding the extension, or whether there was any way. And my co-supervisor was actually, he is a super nice person, and always tries to help his own students, but also students who he has worked with for a long time, which obviously he was my co-supervisor, was the case for me. And he had a student himself in his unit too, who was kind of about to get stuck on the island, and so he wrote an email to pledge my case and his own student's case, and to also request that there would be budget to pay our extensions, just because it was such an extraordinary circumstances that a unit could not have planned for. And the reality was, at that point, the Japanese borders were closed, so new hires that were supposed to come to OIST couldn't also really come. Any postdocs, any technicians you had hired could not start their job because they couldn't come to Japan. And so there was some spare budget, but it wasn't in the unit budget, so really it was a very reasonable request to have it funded from the central budget that was now not used for people who should have come, but at that point couldn't come, if that makes sense. So the whole issue was escalated to, I believe, the COVID task force that we had at OIST within the same day. So they took this whole thing very seriously. And I was promised that I would be able to get a contract extension. And in addition, there was a promise that this extension would be paid from a special or a different budget, and that my unit wouldn't have to pay for it. So after that, unfortunately, I kind of got caught up in some interinstitutional administrative battles. I absolutely hate them, and so my contract extension was kind of dragged out for the coming weeks, and I didn't have anything on paper till early May. In the meantime, OIST had also closed down, so the cases on Okinawa finally began to spike, actually the cases in all of Japan, and Okinawa eventually declared a state of emergency and OIST closed down. But eventually, as I said, my contract extension went through, and I was in a relatively stable place. I was believing I would be able to move to the US in early August, so we had pushed back my start date to early August by 2 months, believing that hopefully at that point the first wave would be over, and I would be able to travel to the US and find a flat and take shelter either before the second wave hits, or that maybe the whole thing would be over because, herd immunity or enough people who did not survive the illness. But yeah, we believed early August may be a time where I would be able to travel to the US, at least to move to the US. And so I felt relatively safe at that point. And eventually OIST opened back up. I ran some more experiments. I was still concerned about how to organize my move, but I continued selling stuff. And I promised that people could have specific things in late July or early August. And that went on till late June. So late June comes around and I've realized that obviously I would have to quarantine for 14 days after entering the US. So one, we would kind of have to adjust my start date for that. And two, I wasn't quite sure how the whole getting a social security number thing would work, because in general, once you're onboarded, you have to get your social security number within 14 days. And let's say we would not adjust my start date, I would kind of still be in quarantine, but I would need to get a social security number. And if we would adjust my start date, the onboarding and everything would get very tight with my visa requirements, which state that I have to start my position within 30 days of arriving in the US. So on inquiring about all of these things, I got an email back, which basically said, oh yeah, by the way, social security offices in the US are closed right now. And if you can't get a social security number within 14 days after you start your position with us, we don't actually know if we can hire you. And I was like, oh great, maybe you should have, communicated that information to me. Luckily enough, I got this email before the end of June. And that was great because I was supposed to move to the US in early August. And so my OIST contract at that point had been extended till July 31st. And we have a clause in our housing contracts stating that we have to terminate our housing contract a month before we want to move out, so June 30th. So luckily enough, it was before June 30th, and because of the uncertainty of everything, I had not yet terminated my housing contract or my apartment contract. So I got an email that I should be doing that soon. Around the same time I got the email about them not knowing if they can hire me. So yeah, at that point I really didn't know what to do, because it wasn't clear if I could go or not, and I didn't think there would be a resolution before the time I would have to terminate my housing contract, and I wasn't quite sure what would happen if I wouldn't terminate my housing contract and then would terminate it in mid-July, but actually would terminate my OIST contract at the end of July and would still leave on August 1st, and OIST couldn't tell me what would happen either. They were basically clueless what would happen if I would still have the housing contract with them after my OIST contract was terminated, because officially that shouldn't be possible. However, there also weren't any rules against it in the contract. and it was a really odd situation. So I went to graduate school, who told me that they wouldn't know what would happen, and I asked whether, it would maybe be possible for me to terminate my housing contract but extend my OIST contract later on, and if maybe they could put me up in our guest house, because obviously at that point our guest house was empty because no visitors could enter Japan, and they told me that would be impossible because I'm not a visitor. And they basically ended up giving me another contract extension as the only option, but they also told me that I could only terminate a contract at the end of every month. So they told me they were unable to terminate the contract type I was on mid-month. I'm not sure if they are actually unable to terminate these contracts mid-month or if they are just too lazy to do it. I don't know. But yeah, basically they gave me a contract extension as the only option, but they also told me if you extend your contract through August, you have to stay till the end of August. There's no way we can terminate your contract mid-month. They told me I could take leave to leave mid-month, but I also only had so much annual leave left. So they put me in a really tight spot. But basically at that point that was my only option. So I decided, you know what, if that's the only option they gave me, I will request another contract extension. And if I have to leave, I will just leave and they can sort it out. Like, I was completely over it. They were helpful in some ways, but they were really not helpful in other ways. And so I decided to just, take the contract extension and then have them figure it out if I had to leave earlier. So I ended up extending my contract on June 30th, the latest day I could have decided, and they asked me to extend it through the end of October, which at that point was the longest time period they had allowed people to extend contracts based on extraordinary circumstances that were due to the virus. And so I ended up extending my contract through the end of October, and I decided I would just tell them when I would know when I would leave, and I would just leave and, have them sorted out. So in the meanwhile, I tried to clarify what NYU's plan was, and also whether I could start to the US if I wouldn't be able to start my position immediately, potentially by, voluntarily working or doing my position's tasks. So as I closely touched on earlier, my visa type requires me to start my position within 30 days, but I was hoping that maybe, if I couldn't get a social security number, I could just start my position unpaid, and then they could back pay me when I got my social security number, but I would still be starting my position even though it would be unpaid at that point. And yeah, I tried to figure out whether NYU had any plan at all. So I had a department liaison that had communicated with me about the visa, and so she was the person I was emailing with. And the responses I got, like in general, the response rate was pretty sparse, like her responsiveness was not great. And then on top of that, when I would get a response, it often did not answer the questions I had asked. So, like, either she didn't know and didn't inquire with the people who would know, or she thought she knew, or honestly, I have no idea what was going on. But basically, none of my questions got answered, and the main strategy of NYU seemed to be to wait for me to come till Social Security offices would be back open. And at that point, you know, the virus was in full swing. We still didn't know how long it would take for a vaccine to develop. And the earliest I could see Social Security offices to open back up was July 2021. So really that was not an option for me. So I talked with my new PI about this whole topic. After getting like sparse replies and not getting my questions answered for about 3 weeks. And he basically, I talked with him and he suggested to email the international office directly. And so knowing that it would be fine, at least he would not say anything if I bypassed the department's liaison officer, I decided to do exactly that. So I emailed NYU's international office directly, and I basically asked them if there was a way to enter the US if I could not start my position within 30 days, if it would be possible to have me on an unpaid position, as long as I would start to do the task specified in my visa, if I could still enter even if I would be unpaid. And I also asked them what they knew about the whole Social Security office situation. And they did confirm that I can only come to the US if I can start my position within 30 days. However, they also told me that this could be an unpaid appointment. So at that point, I basically ended up with 3 options that would still allow me to come. The first option would be to convince my department to create an unpaid position / appointment for me that I could start without a Social Security number. The second option would be to find some way to get a Social Security number within 14 days of starting my position, but that avenue seemed pretty hopeless, given that Social Security offices were closed and you needed an appointment to get into to apply for a Social Security number. And that from everything I had read, it was close to impossible to get an appointment with the Social Security office. And the last option was obviously to convince NYU to hire me without a Social Security number. And the reason that was an option was that the main reason NYU did not or did insist on me needing to have a social security number within 14 days is that the IRS used to fine businesses that would employ personnel that did not have a social security number within 14 days. And that's obviously an issue. However, the IRS had issued a statement in May 2020 saying that they would not do that and that they would not fine businesses because they understood that people may have issues getting a social security number within 14 days, given that social security offices were closed and you could only apply for a social security number if or when you were able to get an appointment with them. And so I kept pushing for them to follow up on one of these options. I kept pushing for my department liaison to talk to HR to see if they can either hire me without a social security number or create an unpaid appointment for me. And I was also phoning up every single social security office within anywhere close to Manhattan. And I would basically just tell them I'm a J1 scholar, I need a social security number, and ask them what the wait times for appointments were. And that was just to see whether there was any office that had a shorter wait time, or whether there was, any way that I, on arrival, could move to a borough that had a social security office with a shorter wait time. And I was very willing to move to such a borough just to be able to even move to the US. And I found one social security office that told me they usually have a 1-week turnaround time for appointments. But also, if you call the social security office 3 times in a day, you will hear 3 different replies regarding the wait time. So that was nice and everything, but it wasn't the safest avenue. So at that point, I was willing to wait a little bit longer. I wasn't sure if I would want to take that gamble, knowing that if I would not be able to get a social security number, I would need to fly to Germany. If I would not be able to get a social security number within 14 days, I would not be able to start my position at NYU within 30 days. So I would not be able to fulfill my visa requirements. And then I would need to leave the US again and fly to Germany. And so that was a really risky avenue that at that point I still tried to avoid. So things got pretty tight and I didn't really know what to do. I have to admit I started to look for jobs in Europe because as a European I can easily enter Europe and start a job over there. And I was thinking about setting NYU an ultimatum that either they find a solution that I can come before November 30th, or I would have to look for a job elsewhere. I didn't do any of these things, but it got to a point where it felt really, really hopeless. NYU had not replied to me. So they hadn't replied to me. They still didn't have a solution. It felt like they just kept me waiting, hoping that social security offices would open back up, which, obviously it was obvious that wouldn't happen. And it just didn't feel like anybody cared or anybody was working on a solution. So I eventually wrote an email to my department liaison, I believe, and my new PI, basically informing them that if I did not have a reply by August 28, I would not be able to start within September, because the idea was if by August 28th I did not have a reply, that was a Friday, by the way, I would not be able to terminate my housing contract on the upcoming Monday, which would basically mean I would have to stay an additional month at OIST. So I basically informed them about that. I didn't think it would lead to anything. But I also knew that our department liaison had a meeting coming up with HR. However, I didn't hear anything right after the meeting, so I wasn't sure what was going on. I had really low hopes. I thought I would have to stay another month for sure, and the earliest I could move to the US would then be mid-October. However, I really couldn't sleep. In general, in that time, I had really bad insomnia and I couldn't sleep at nights. But for some reason, I decided to check my emails at 3 a.m. on August 29th, which was late afternoon in New York City on the 28th. And I saw an email saying, you can come. We can onboard you and hire you. HR agreed to onboard you and hire you without a social security number. Or rather, the director for employee experience agreed that HR will onboard you without a social security number and that you will be able to start your position without a social security number. And I started crying. It was so much weight that fell off me at that point. I didn't know whom to tell first. Eventually I figured out it was like 4 a.m. So it was about maybe 9 p.m. in Germany. So I figured I need to ask my parents if they can Skype, and I set up a Skype call with them at 4 a.m. and I told them, and I was crying, and it was really emotional. Mind at that point, I didn't have a bed any longer, I didn't have a couch, I didn't even have a dining table. Those were all sold, I believe. So I was so happy I could move. I had been sleeping, so my bed, because I thought I would be able to leave in early August, I had sold my bed and I had given it away, I believe, somewhere in mid-August, and I was sleeping on a foldable mattress that I were given by a friend, and it was I was living without any furniture, basically. It was really, really interesting, and I was so happy I could go and I wouldn't have to live in this kind of living situation any longer. And also in general, I could go, and I was extremely happy at that point. And then kind of, I could sleep. But then kind of the next day, it kind of started to sink in that there were a lot of things that I needed to do. And so first thing I did was I noticed that I would like to cancel my housing contract, and I informed graduate school that I would terminate my contract on September 30th. And within a week, I've wrapped up all my projects at OIST and backed up all my data. I booked flights. I sold stuff like crazy. I moved stuff to OIST to give away for free. It was like under my desk. And yeah, I as I said, I booked a flight, and I booked a flight for September 23rd from Okinawa to Tokyo, and then from Tokyo to New York on September 24th. And because OIST was unable to terminate my contract in the middle of the month, I took all my remaining leave. And yeah, I started to sell stuff. I moved out of my flat. I canceled all my utility contracts. I had to sell my car. It's almost impossible to not have a car in Okinawa. And I had to do all of that in like 2 weeks. And I also had to figure out how to move my stuff. So at that point, like, was in the early stages of the whole situation in 2020, Japan Post had, and also all other mail carriers in Japan had suspended any kind of parcel post from Japan to the US. So at that point, I was quite fortunate that Japan Post had resumed parcels from Japan to the US by boat, but by boat only. No airmail, no nothing. And also, like, without, it wasn't a great option, but it was the only option. And also, you had to do your own customs, so I wasn't quite sure. Also, knowing the US mail system isn't the greatest, I wasn't quite sure if whatever I would parcel would make it. And none of the moving companies that were halfway affordable were even offering to conduct a move to the US at that point, again because of the virus. And so I ended up deciding to check one additional suitcase and to parcel one moving box with Japan Post. So I had to get rid of a lot of things. I was just constantly selling stuff, and then I ended up bringing so much stuff. I donated so much stuff to charity, and yeah, it was just the only way. But I certainly lost a bunch of money on that move just because I donated stuff and then I bought it again over here full price. And also because the Wednesday I flew out was right after holiday weekend. I had to move out of my flat by that Friday. And so I ended up staying at a friend's place for the last couple of days. And yeah, then I finally went to the airport. I was extremely nervous. At that point, a whole bunch of visa categories had been banned from entering the US, and also a good bunch of J1 visa categories had been banned to enter the US, and I am in the US on a J1 visa, and my visa category wasn't banned. However, I wasn't quite sure how well educated the airport staff in Okinawa would be on the visa categories that were banned and weren't banned, given that at that point it was a domestic airport. Like there were no international flights going in and out of Okinawa at that point in time. And so I went to the airport, and sure enough, they started to look up like visa requirements and stuff, and I showed them the proclamation. I showed them that my category wasn't included. I told them I knew I was allowed to fly. And then obviously I had to check additional baggage. And interestingly, that was the bigger issue than my visa, because, well, yeah, they don't do a lot of, additional baggage in Japan. Like, I've never seen anyone check additional baggage. And so they wanted to charge me the domestic rate, even though they told me it would be checked through. And then I told them that can't be right. And then they started a huge discussion. And then they had issues billing it. And I don't know, it took them like 45 minutes to check me in. So the good thing was I was the only person with a connecting flight. They had to open up the counter just for me, like the counter for international connecting flights. And so it didn't really matter. I didn't hold up anyone. I had 6 people who tried to figure out my case for 45 minutes. And let's put it that way, my carry-on luggage was kind of heavy, probably heavier than it should be, and also kind of bulky, but the airline I flew with Japanese Airlines. I had told them, look, I'm checking an additional bag because there is no mail carrier that will send stuff. I usually wouldn't even check an additional bag, and I'm so sorry. And so they were very polite and turned their backs on my carry-on luggage. They were extremely empathetic. I think they knew I was extremely nervous. They had my passport, so they knew I was German, trying to fly from Japan to the US in the middle of a worldwide crisis. And yeah, they were extremely empathetic with my situation, and I am so thankful to Japan Airlines for this. I am extremely grateful. So eventually they checked me in. They came after me, they found me again at the gate because the receipt they had given me was wrong, and they gave me the right receipt. And yeah, everything went smoothly. I got on the airplane with all of my carry-on luggage. I had a night-long layover in Tokyo. I got on the next flight. So the domestic flight was extremely full. It was booked out to the last seat, which I found really surprising. The international flight, however, was extremely empty. We were maybe 30 people on the flight. So when we got to the US, they separated people into an ESTER line, a US citizen line, I believe, and into a first entry was ESTER, and any kind of visa line. And the majority of people, of course, at that point were like first entry ESTER people, or people with a J1 or F1 or any kind of non-immigrant visa, because there are many reasons why you would fly from Japan to the US, why you would fly internationally in the middle of 2020. It's just, unless you have to, you would not fly international, or you would not have flown internationally at that point. So the line moved really slowly. They did not expect that many people to be in the line, but I eventually made it through the line. I made it out of the airport. I had been smart enough to pre-book a driver from the airport to where I was staying, which was a room in Chinatown, and I needed to have like a room with my own kitchen and my own bathroom, because I had to quarantine for 14 days. So I got to my room, I eventually checked in, I quarantined for 14 days, and then the onboarding process for NYU began. And that process was very time consuming, but one of the biggest issues with the whole process was that early on I had been told I would need, in order to access any lab building, I would need to get a nasal swab COVID-19 PCR test, and I would be able to call a specific hospital to get the test, and I would be on a list. And I called the hospital and they told me I'm not on the list, and I called them again and again, and eventually I talked with the person who had given me the information, and they told me, no, you can't call till after your whole onboarding process is over and you're in the system. And so I stopped calling them for some time, and eventually, like, my general onboarding process with NYU was completed, and I started to call them again and again and again, and I still wasn't on the list, and no one knew what was going on. So at that point I was like, okay, let me see whether I can find the guidelines online, and I googled them myself. And what had happened was that apparently they had changed the guidelines in the meantime, and you now had to do a spit COVID-19 PCR test to get access to lab buildings, or you could still do a nasal swab test, but you would need to organize that yourself. So at that point, the rules had changed. No one had told the person who was giving me the information, and no one had told me. So I found that out about like a good time after I was out of quarantine, and I lost at least a week, and it was extremely frustrating. So yeah, I eventually got the test done, and I got access to the lab buildings. Also, apparently I was supposed to pick up my NYU ID card as soon as possible, and no one told me that I was supposed to do that, so I eventually found that out and went and picked it up. I had to get a bank account, which you kind of need a social security number for, or at least a permanent address, and I was in a hotel, like I was staying in kind of a hotel. It wasn't a rental, So I didn't have a permanent address yet, and I didn't have a social security number. So I mailed them a bunch of documents, and they eventually agreed to open up a bank account for me. And then I was trying to get a social security number. Actually, that was one of the first things I did. The very first Monday I was in the US, I picked up the phone, I called the Social Security office and told them I need a Social Security number as soon as possible. And they told me they have at least a 2 months wait time for appointments. They would call me back once, they would put me on a list, and they would call me back once they get to my name on the list. I would take at least 2 months. I expected that, so I was like, fine, I will wait for your call. Knowing the wiser, no social security number, I was also starting to look for a flat, because the room I had booked, I had only booked it for months, and it was also pretty expensive. And oh boy, I didn't have a social security number, so I wasn't able to use a guarantor service, and I also didn't have a credit score, and I didn't make 40 times rent for most apartments. So I didn't check any of the boxes that you need to check to get an apartment in New York City. So I set up viewings for apartments, for rooms. I got to a point where I was certain I would have to move into like a shared housing situation and just, get a room within a flat. Just because I didn't check the boxes to get a flat on my own. But I was lucky enough, and eventually I got an email from NYU telling me that they had an apartment available for me. So NYU has subsidized housing for postdocs, and I had applied for the subsidized housing in August 2019. And they finally had an apartment available for me in October 2020. So I was on the wait list for 14 months. And I was really lucky that I got an apartment at that point in time. I happily took it. And I also didn't have many other options, as I just outlined. So I did get a flat. The next thing was getting an appointment with the Department for Motor Vehicles. So you need, in order to get either non-driver's ID in the US or a learner's permit, which is like the kind of permit you need to eventually get a driver's license, you need to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, and because of the virus, that's also appointment only right now. And the website sucks. Like, it absolutely sucks. And I ended up spending 4 hours one morning just refreshing the website till I managed to get an appointment to apply for a learner's permit. So I decided to eventually get a driver's license, and I decided to apply for a learner's permit. So I had an appointment for that. I was still waiting on an appointment for my social security number, and the address that was on file with NYU in my employee account was my temporary address, which I eventually changed into my permanent address. But while I was still living in temporary accommodation, I signed up for healthcare with my employer, and I had huge issues to get like access to my healthcare card, and I ended up paying out of pocket for private health insurance for an additional month. They told me it would be active and I could submit claims later on, but I didn't want to count on it. And I ended up having to call the insurance company and to actually verify my data and get the required information to set up an online account, to get a copy of my card online, and to get the card resent, because I have no idea where they sent it to. I never got it. And I had a similar experience from my dental insurance. So yeah, I was a lot of emailing and calling people and being on the phone, and it just felt like it's never ending. So in the meantime, October rolled around, I moved into my new flat. I started to order furniture. I had more emailing and phoning going on because I didn't have money in my US account yet, so I was using my German credit card, which has a different billing address than what my shipping address is, obviously. And so, yeah, some orders got cancelled and I had to call. I was like, there was a lot of stuff going on. And so October rolled around, November rolled around, late November rolled around, still no call from the Social Security office. Eventually, I was out for like a get-together with some of the other postdocs from my department. And I talked to one of the postdocs who arrived around the same time as me. And he told me, they never called me back. Obviously, they never called me back. What are you thinking? Do you really expect them to call you back? We are in the US. So I just kept calling the Social Security office. And sure enough, eventually I found someone who made an appointment for me. And I have had a Social Security number for quite some time now. I was like, oh, great. So that was on a Friday, so the next Monday rolled around, which coincidentally was also my birthday. And I got on the phone and I kept calling the Social Security office. And the first person I had on the phone was extremely rude when I told him that my colleague got an appointment already and we arrived around the same time and I really, really need an appointment too. He was like, "You're entitled, you're arrogant about this, I can't help you," and he hung up on me. So I was like, at that point I started crying because I didn't believe any longer they would call me back to make an appointment, and I didn't know what to do. I really, really needed a Social Security number. So I called them again and again and again, and the calls dropped. I was waiting so long till I got through again, and then the next person was rude again. And then I called again and again and again, and after 5 hours, I managed to get through to a person whom I told, "Look, I've been here for over 2 months. I called over 2.5 months ago. I had been told I would be called back. That just never happened. And I really need a Social Security number." And she told me, yeah, sure, no problem. I can make an appointment for you next week. And so yeah, I got an appointment. I scrapped together all documents that I would need and documents where I wasn't sure if I would need them, just in case, because it was so hard to get that appointment that I really, really didn't want to have to go back. So yeah, I took a binder full with documents and I went there. I waited a good time. I submitted my documents. I waited, another good time, because obviously you always end up in the line that moves the slowest. And yeah, eventually they told me my application would be processed. They gave me a piece of paper and they told me my card would be mailed to me within the next 2 weeks. So I was happy that that had been done. I was really hoping they would mail me my card. And also in the very same week, I had my appointment with the Department for Motor Vehicles to apply for my learner's permit. So when you apply for your learner's permit in New York State, you have to take a written test about road rules. I had studied up on the road rules and I actually got 100%. I don't know why the lady told me, because I looked at her and was like, cool, do I get a prize? And she was like, nah. I was like, oh, okay, cool, I got 100%, great. But yeah, I got there. I again took way too many documents. I was still applying without a social security number, obviously, because I had applied but it hadn't been issued yet. So I applied under, it's called green light law, and you have to submit specific documents that prove that you live where you say you live, and that your residency is actually in New York State. And so I took like any document I could think of, just in case they wouldn't accept one of them. So I had a full binder with like documents that had my address on it. I had my passport with me, my German birth certificate, like anything I could think of, because they also have to make sure that you are you. So they need your passport. And yeah, luckily they accepted all the documents. I passed my test, as I said, I got 100%. And they told me they would send me my learner's permit, which also functions as a state ID. So without a non-driver's ID or learner's permit or a driver's ID, you always have to carry your passport. Like, let's say you want to buy a bottle of beer, you have to be over 21, right? So you would have to carry your passport. Just it doesn't feel great to carry around your passport if it's the only identification document that you have. And so yeah, at that point, I still didn't really feel like I was settled in the country, because I didn't have any kind of US identification documents still. So I was extremely happy when I had passed the test, and I was just hoping the learner's permit would eventually show up in my mail. And sure enough, my social security number showed up on Christmas Eve, and I communicated it to HR right away and to anyone who would need it, like my bank, my German bank. So that's all done. I got my social security number. It felt like a huge win, just because of how hard it was to get this appointment. And finally, in early January, I got my learner's permit. And now for the very first time, I feel like I'm settled in the US. I don't fight a constant administrative battle. And I'm still not quite settled into my flat, but it feels like I finally arrived and my whole moving story is over. Now, in early January. And this whole story started, as I said, in August 2019. The actual moving story started in late February 2020 when I started to get my paperwork mailed from NYU. So let's say early March 2020 when I received my paperwork. So I have now, it took me 10 months to move from Okinawa to the US and to actually feel like I'm settled and grounded and safe and won't be kicked out of the country because I have a social security number, I have some form of identification, I have a job, I have a flat. It has been a very unstable year for me, a lot of ups and downs in 2020, but I finally made it. And if you are in a similar situation, or you were in a similar situation, as you can see from my story, people are moving again. And I met other postdocs who recently moved to NYU from somewhere else in the world, who had to do an international move to get here, and people are moving again. So if you have been stuck somewhere or you are still trying to get somewhere, please persevere. People are moving again. You can do it and you will eventually make it. And if you are still trying, you moved to the US or you moved somewhere else and you are still trying to get this one number that you really, really need, or you are still trying to open a bank account, you can do it. Whoever is watching, whoever is out there, you can do it. Stay strong, stay healthy, obviously. And yeah, if you made it till here, that's great. I know it's a really, really, really long video. And if you watched, I appreciate that. And yeah, it was tough, but you can do it. You can do it too. And yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about today. This is my story, how I moved from Okinawa, Japan to New York City, US, from my PhD institution to my postdoc institution in the middle of 2020. And I hope you learned something or got something from it. And yeah, thanks for watching, and see you soon. Bye.